First couple verses of this, Mark writes, "When Jesus had crossed over again in the boat to the other side, a large crowd gathered around him. So he stayed by the seashore. One of the synagogue officials named Jairus came up to him and seeing him, fell at his feet and begged him earnestly, saying, 'My little daughter is at the point of death. Please come and lay your hands on her so that she will get well and live.' And he went off with him, and a large crowd was following him and pressing in on him." After the encounter with Legion on the Gentile side of the Galilee, the people want Jesus to leave the country. He and the disciples get back in the boat and they cross the Sea of Galilee again. It says they came back to the other side. Most likely, people argue about this, most likely they came back to Capernaum. That was the base that Jesus had for his ministry in Galilee. And I think there's enough evidence and common sense to assume that Jesus came back to Capernaum. He's greeted by a large crowd. You know, the word was out, the reputation was out when he came back. That's why they left in the first place. There was too many people, too many things going on. Comes back, the crowd is there, and in the crowd is a man named Jairus, one of the synagogue officials. What the synagogue officials did was they were kind of the scheduling, maintenance type of people. They took care of the scrolls, made sure they were rolled up properly, returned. They took care of the building, any building issues. They helped schedule the speakers. They did all the kind of maintenance to keep the synagogue working. One of the synagogue officials named Jairus comes up to Jesus. Mark gives us his name, which is very unusual in Mark. He rarely gives a name, personal name of a person. But thinking back, I don't know if it was mentioned or not. I may have mentioned it. One of the great gifts that God has given me is I never remember what I say or do, so I can continue on to the next day, because otherwise the burden of my past history would just incapacitate me. But many scholars believe that Peter was the source for most of the information that Mark gave us. Peter was firsthand, Peter was on the scene, Peter was there, he gave his information to Mark. And it's very likely that it was Peter who told Mark that the synagogue official's name was Jairus. And if you think about it, and this is one of the things I really like about just the common sense of the scripture, it makes perfect sense. Peter lived in Capernaum, not far, I'm telling you, to the back of this room away from the synagogue. So it's very possible that he knew Jairus personally, that Jairus knew Peter. Because Peter would attend, Peter was there, Peter was known in town. So he very possibly could have known Jairus personally. It's also very possible that Jairus knew Jesus. Maybe not intimately, but might have been acquainted. Remember, he was the synagogue official. At the very beginning of Mark, we read the account where Jesus came, spoke with authority, and cast a demon out of the synagogue in Capernaum. Most likely Jairus was there. He was the guy making sure that everything was done the way it needed to be done. He probably had seen Jesus do this. Certainly, being in Capernaum, he had heard a lot of stories about Jesus, and he had perfect faith that Jesus had the ability to cure his daughter. And he comes out, when Jesus comes out of the boat, he runs up, he falls on the ground, and he begs Jesus to heal his daughter. I can so understand why he would do that. When I was 18, it was the first time that somebody that I was really close to died, my grandmother. I can't tell you how much I loved my grandmother and my grandfather. And I think that's true with many people. You know, I think back, and my grandmother had a cerebral hemorrhage. Put her in ICU. And this is, almost 30 years ago. And they do more things now than they did then. Pretty much then, in a situation like this, when it was that serious, they put people in ICU and you waited. That's pretty much what happened. And I remember that my grandmother was in there, and I thought, I would do anything in the world if she would get better. I don't know, I'm sure, most of you who are near my age, you understand that emotion. You would do anything, especially if it was your children. I would give my own life in exchange if one of my children was sick and I knew that would heal them. I wouldn't even think about it. I know I would do it. And I think that's how Jairus was. He was in one of those situations where you would do anything in the world for the healing, but there was nothing you could do. And that's one of the most frustrating things. I'm sure we all know it. We've all seen our friends. We've all had families. We've all been in a hospital. When it comes to that point in time when there's nothing anyone can do, and you would do anything, but there's nothing that you can do. And this is how Jairus was. His daughter, it says, was near death, literally at death's door. She was dying, and Jairus knew it, and he came and fell on his feet. He's an important man in Capernaum, synagogue official. Fell on his feet and begged Jesus, fell down on the ground and begged him. Any parent would do the same thing. I feel the difficulty that he had. And as former President Bill Clinton would say, I feel his pain. I mean, what a horrible situation. I don't know, too, this is another thing that's really weird to me. I don't know if Jesus had a schedule in his mind. You know, we never really think about that. He certainly had a plan and worked his plan. His plan was the will of God, but maybe he had something else planned, humanly speaking, that day. But when Jairus came, everything changed. The crowd's pressing in on him and going with him. And, you know, I have never been to a country overseas, in any place in the world, that takes their personal space as seriously as we do in the U.S. You know, in the United States, somebody gets close to you, man, that is so, you hate that, you know? And some people, when they get mad, they say, hey, get out of my face. Don't be pointing at me. Don't stand next to me. Don't push on me. Like, when you go overseas, especially in the Middle East, and Israel to this day, in the Middle East, there's no such thing as a line. You know, it's like, if there's empty space, you go into it. And he had the crowd just pressing in on him, this big crowd. They're all kind of following him along and pushing him along. And then it says, in the middle of all of this action, a woman who had a hemorrhage for 12 years and had endured much at the hands of many physicians and spent all that she had and was not helped at all, but rather had grown worse. After hearing about Jesus, she came up in the crowd behind him and touched his cloak. For she thought, if I just touch his garments, I will get well. Here comes this woman we don't know anything about in the middle of this huge pressing crowd, and Mark describes her this way. She has a hemorrhage, 12 years, mostly menstrual bleeding, probably, uncontrollable for 12 years. I can't imagine that. It says she endured much with many physicians. She went to all kinds of doctors, tried everything. And that's another thing that's so common to human nature, which just shows the reality and the truth of the Bible. When people get sick, they try everything. You try things that you would never try. This woman tried every possible thing. She went from one doctor to another, spent all her money. Everything she had. She was pretty destitute, and she was not helped, but she got worse. I cannot imagine the horror of living like that day to day for 12 years. And imagine that happening in our time, right? Think back then. I didn't know if I should say this or not, and that made up my mind that I would say it, but did you ever go to a quack? I've been to quacks. Yeah, there's nothing more frustrating than that. Because you got to pay anyway, and now they make you pay up front. You're sitting in anything. I just gave, my deductible. I gave $55 to this quack. That's what you're sitting there. That's what I'm thinking anyway. But we had a doctor when we lived in South Jersey that was a quack. No matter what was the matter with you, a guy give you a needle. We used to call him Needles Nicholas, the doctor. Well, who are you going to see? I'm going to see Needles. No matter what it was, gave you a needle. This poor woman endured much at the hands of many physicians. She went from one to another constantly. No one could ease her suffering. Luke, in recording this account, says, and Luke, remember, was a doctor. Luke said she could not be healed. That's how Luke diagnoses her. This woman had an incurable problem. I can't imagine that. And in addition to all of this personal suffering, According to the law of Moses, she was unclean. She had a flow of blood that made her unclean. Anybody that touched her, anybody that came in contact with her, was unclean until evening. This woman was a social outcast, in addition to her personal suffering. And this type of thinking still is true. I don't know if you ever follow the news on El Al Airlines. Sometimes they bring it up. The Orthodox Jewish men to this day avoid contact with women on the chance that a woman may be having her period, which would make her unclean, and a man would not come in contact with her because then he would become unclean. There were several incidents on El Al Airlines where the flights were held up for hours because an Orthodox man would take his seat and then a woman would come and sit next to him, and he would refuse to have the woman sit there. He would demand that she be reseated or he be reseated because he didn't want to come in contact with her. If you ever get, there's several Orthodox people out here, nothing like on the East Coast or the West Coast, but if you're a woman, you get into an elevator with an Orthodox man, they will go on the opposite side of the elevator. They don't want to become unclean. This was this woman's life. Josephus, in addition to this, he writes in his history, Josephus, the Jewish historian, he said, the temple was closed to women who were having their period. This woman was suffering horribly personally. This woman was an outcast in society. And this woman couldn't come into the temple to worship for 12 years. That is really a sad, lonely life that she had. And then, one of the things, and see, now we're in the middle of the sandwich. We start out with Jairus, now we're in the middle of the sandwich with a woman. We start to learn about her and hear about her. And then it says, despite her uncleanness, this is one of the things I like about this woman too. She got in the crowd and wanted to touch Jesus. She got in the middle of that crowd, and as they pressed in on her, she started to press in on him. Some people felt at that time that to touch a garment, if it was an important person, that somehow the power, the magic, so to speak, of the garments were from that person went into another person. Most likely what this woman touched was the fringe on a prayer shawl, the talit. Jesus would have been wearing it. When it says she touched his garment, she probably touched the fringe of his prayer shawl, believing that she would be healed. And there were several commentators who said that this woman was superstitious, she was magical, and I don't really think that's an accurate picture. A few chapters earlier in Mark, this is what Mark writes about Jesus. Listen, and he told his disciples that a boat should stand ready for them because of the crowd. Remember, that's how he goes on one side and he comes back. He's at the shore, it's really crowded, and Jesus says to the guy, get a boat, because this crowd's pushing us and pushing us. We have to have some place to go. And it says, because of the crowd, so they would not crowd him, for he had healed many, with the result that all of those who had afflictions pressed around him in order to touch him. When this woman wanted to go and touch Jesus, she was not the only person who had the idea of touching him in order to be healed. It was a belief that was spread throughout the crowd. All the people believed it. And I would not doubt, this is Capernaum, she's at Capernaum, the people wanted to touch Jesus in Capernaum. I wouldn't doubt that she had actually spoken to some of the people that touched him. And this woman was desperate. She wanted to touch Jesus. James Edwards, in talking about this woman from verse 27, and I think this is a great observation, he said she was a true disciple. It said, after hearing about Jesus, she came up in the crowd and touched his cloak. She heard, she came, she touched. That's a real disciple. And this is what this woman did. And as soon as she touched him, Mark says, immediately the flow of her blood was dried up. She felt in her body she was healed of her affliction. And immediately Jesus, perceiving that power had gone out from him, turned around to the crowd and said, who touched my garments? And his disciples said, you see the crowd pressing in on you, and you say, who touched me? And he looked around to see the woman who had done this. But the woman, fearing and trembling and aware of what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your affliction. Mark says she immediately felt that she was healed. And the word affliction could also easily be translated as torment. She immediately knew that her torment was over. I don't know how she was aware of it, but she was totally aware that she was cleansed. It says power came out of him. The only place in the Gospels that this is mentioned. And it's kind of a strange concept. How can that be? I think that it's juggling many different ideas that are hard to understand. One is that we know that when Jesus came to earth, he was limited. He accepted limitations on himself while he was here. You remember the disciples asked him, when is your return? He said, those dates and times are set by the Father. Did Jesus not know? He did know, but he willingly limited himself. I believe what happened here is that the power that was in him was the power of God in him, not his own personal power, if I could put it that way. And I think that what happened here is he felt the power of God that resided in him because he willingly limited himself. He felt that power go out of him. And in this sense, difficult to understand, I believe it's God who allowed that to happen. Because Jesus limited himself while he was here. So he felt that power of God go out of him, and he wanted to know what happened. He was just like the woman. He knew something that happened, but it wasn't a conscious move on his part, like when he willingly healed people and used the power of God. God allowed it to happen. Jesus was unaware to the extent that he had limited himself. And that's what I think happened. And he knew something happened, just like the woman. And he knew it was something unique because it said the crowd was pressing in on him. So it wasn't like this woman was the only person that was touching him. And I'm telling you, if you're in the Middle East, people are touching you all the time. They're crowding in on you. But this was different than just a touch. There was more that was involved in this. And he says to his disciples, who touched me? And literally, they said to him, are you kidding me? What are you, out of your mind? Everybody touched you. You know? To them it was a crazy question. But see, he wanted to have a personal encounter with this woman to let her know that her healing did not occur because of a touch, but because of her faith. And it was important for him. That's why he wanted to find this woman. He wanted to get the whole situation straightened out. William Lane says it was the grasp of her faith rather than her hand that secured her healing. And that's really true. That's exactly what happened. It was her faith inside. In faith, she reached out. Her faith healed her, not the contact with the garment of Jesus. And it says that Jesus said, who touched me? And the woman was afraid. I don't blame this poor woman. I cannot imagine. What a courageous person. Nobody would have anything to do with her. She should not have been in the crowd. People would have got angry if they knew she was in the crowd. But she came through anyway. And then Jesus said, who touched me? She felt the conviction to tell the story of what happened, but with fear and trembling. And she wanted something, but Jesus wanted someone. She wanted something from him, but he wanted her. It was personal for him. And some people ask, I know this is kind of a side issue, maybe you don't think about things like this, but if she was unclean and touched Jesus, according to the law of Moses, he would have become unclean. Because if you came in contact with a person like this who was unclean, their uncleanness transferred to you. But I think what happens in this instance is because Jesus was divine, because he was the Son of God, I think that things worked in reverse. Her uncleanness didn't transfer to him, but his cleanness transferred to her. That's what I think. It was the greater with the lesser. The same thing happened with the leper, remember? The leper came and asked Jesus to heal him, and Jesus touched him. Touching a leper made you unclean. Why was he not unclean? Because he obeyed the law 100%. That's what made him clean and pure and perfect, to be a sacrifice for our sin. He became sin because he had no sin. There was no uncleanness in him. How could that be? Because it worked in reverse. Because his cleanness cleaned the unclean. It's the same thing that happens with us. It's his purity that purifies us. It's his sinlessness that makes us become sinless in God's sight. She touched him. She was the person who was the beneficiary of who he was. It didn't work the opposite way. To me, it just makes perfect sense. And then what does he say to this woman? And I'm going to look at this again a little bit later, but the compassion of the Son of God. She tells the story and he says to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your torment." Jesus calls her daughter. Speaks of no one else like this in all the Gospels. What great compassion. You know, this woman needed an extra touch because she was an outcast. She spent 12 years on the outside of society. She spent 12 years not being allowed to come in contact with anybody. She spent 12 years not being allowed to come to the temple and pray. And in his compassion, Jesus says, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace." What a tremendous thing to say. I mean, it's just incredible, the compassion that Jesus had. And it says, while he was still speaking, this is like a huge event. While he's still talking to her, a delegation from the house of the synagogue official, group of people come from Jairus' house saying, "Your daughter has died. Why trouble the teacher anymore?" But Jesus, overhearing what was being spoken, said to the synagogue official, "Do not be afraid anymore. Only believe." And he allowed no one to accompany him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. A message comes from the house of Jairus. You know, it's like a news flash. The update. Your daughter's dead. Don't bother this guy anymore. You know, your hope is over. It's finished. He could maybe make her better, but she's dead, so the whole situation is closed. I don't know if Jairus was thinking, I mean, I would have been. I'm revealing my transparent, sinful, selfish self. If that was my daughter, and Jesus stopped to heal some lady, that would really burn me up. I'm telling you, that would be my first initial, I'm telling you the truth. Like, my daughter had a chance, and this woman took it. I think that would be my first thought. And I just wouldn't be happy that he stopped. You know, and it's the same thing as interrupting a plan. I don't know what Jesus' plan was, but Jairus came and interrupted it. Then Jesus had the plan, then the woman came and interrupted it. And if I was Jairus, I just would not be happy about that. It would just really bother me. And I think that Jesus understood that because it says he overheard. The literal translation is he ignored it. Isn't that great? I love that. Listen, your daughter's dead, don't bother this guy anymore. Jesus ignored it. Listen, Jairus, ignore that. Just keep your faith. That's what's important. Don't worry about it anymore. Don't be concerned with your circumstances. Just have faith. Give them over to God. That's what he's telling him. And, you know, I think that's not a hard thing to do, to give your circumstances over to God. I know that I do it, and I do it 100 times. I'm like the guy that, you know, says, "Can you quit smoking?" It's easy. I've done it 100 times. That's the same way I am too with giving something to God. I'm telling you, that's how, you know, I think, yeah, I could do that. And then 10 minutes later, I'm thinking, you know, suppose it doesn't work out the way I want. So, you know, I just do that over and over again. You give the situation, yeah, let's pray, let's give it over to God. Okay, well, I'll give it over to him for, I don't know, a minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes. That's one of the battles. This Jairus was struggling with this. He trusted in Jesus, but he felt that maybe he couldn't really do it. And when he tells him to believe, what he's telling him, it's the imperative, it's a command. Keep believing. Keep believing. That's what he says to him. How difficult that would be. I think it's one of the most difficult things we do as followers of God. Keep believing. We don't live a dream life. We don't, you know, people say that we don't face reality. That's a bunch of baloney. We face reality, and we face reality. I believe that people who trust in God face reality more than anybody else on earth. We look reality right in the eye. But in the midst of it, he says, keep believing. That's what he tells him. And the request is made to Jairus by Jesus, which I think is just I cannot imagine my daughter being at death's door, dying, and Jesus telling me, you keep believing. That's a difficult command to follow. And then the three, he said, only brought the three, Peter, James, and John. I forget which commentator said it, but somebody said the nicknamed three. Peter was Simon, but he got the nickname, which Peter means little rock, little stone, and James and John, the sons of thunder. So Jesus asks a little rock and the sons of thunder to come along with him. You know, it sounded like a rock group to me, an early ancient rock group. Little rock and the sons of thunder. Come on, They come to the house of the synagogue official, and he saw a commotion. You bet your life it was a commotion. People loudly weeping and wailing. And entering in, he said to them, why make a commotion and weep? The child's not dead, she's asleep. They began laughing at him. But putting them all out, he took aside the child's father and mother and his own companions, entered the room where the child was. A commotion. Can you imagine? Let's go into that house. How insane it would be. All of us have been to a funeral or a wake. And the worst in the world are when they involve kids. I can barely handle it. A few years ago, I was asked to do a funeral for a premature baby that died. It was the worst thing I ever did in my life. It was horrid. It was horrible. It was a little baby, and we get to the gravesite, and I'm looking at 25, 30 people who are weeping uncontrollably. And I was too. The problem was I had to say something. But it's hard. You know, funerals are hard. They're raw emotion. And you have the funeral of a child, and it's a commotion. It says there's weeping and wailing. At that time in Israel, they paid mourners. There was regulation, rule, whatever. Even the poorest in Israel was required to hire at least 2 flute players and 1 professional mourner. And the professional mourners made a living by raising as much commotion as possible. And I'll tell you, I grew up, my mom's Sicilian, and therefore so am I. I remember going to funerals when I was a kid. All the old Italians from the old country. You talk about weeping and wailing. I mean, people screamed. It was a little unsettling as a kid. People would throw themselves in a coffin when they were going to close. It was a commotion. And that I thought about this. It says it was a commotion. It was insane. People screaming and weeping, wailing. Not just crying, wailing. In the Middle East, you see people sometimes wailing. Now, it was a crazy scene. And Jesus comes in there and he said, what's going on? But, listen, this kid isn't dead. She's just sleeping. You look in the New Testament, and when they speak about people dying, they talk about people sleeping, especially of the believers. Never dead, sleeping. In Jesus' mind, the same thing would happen with Lazarus, remember? He's up and away from where Lazarus was, and he dies, and they're coming down, and the disciples say, hey, we better hurry up, Lazarus is going to die. The word comes, Lazarus dies, and Jesus, don't worry, he's sleeping. The disciples didn't know he's taking a nap, big deal. Well, that's how it is to God. That's one of the things, we spoke about the resurrection. We die, we sleep. It's no big deal to God. We're sleeping. He comes in, he sees a girl, she's sleeping. And then it says, the people in the room started to laugh at him. Now there's so many attacks on Scripture today, and they say, the girl wasn't sleeping, she was in a coma, and blah, 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 blah. She was dead. There were professional mourners there. You think about that. Remember the soldiers that killed Jesus? Those guys were pros. Roman soldiers, they were experts in death. The Romans crucified so many people. The guys that crucified Jesus, that was their job. They knew it. When you go on a job somewhere, you're new and somebody's been there for 25 years and, they have experience. They can tell you, oh, don't do that. This is what you do. You have to do that. They were pros. They knew that Jesus was dead. That was their job. These professional mourners, They knew the girl was dead. That was their job. Why do you think they laughed at him? It says they scorned him. They mocked him. She's just dead. Listen, you know what? They just had pure contempt. We've seen dead people. It's our job to know. And their laughter showed that they just had pure contempt. And because of that, I thought about this when I read this section. Because of that, the Messiah didn't allow them to see the girl get up. Right? It says he sent them all out. And the only ones that went in were the mom and the dad and the 3 little rock group guys. They were the only ones in there. And I thought about something which is really sad, but their contempt for the Messiah did not allow them to see him working. And I thought about that today. There are many people in the world that have just a satanic contempt for God. Is it any wonder why they never see him work? The people that had contempt for him, he put them outside. The people that had faith in him were allowed to see his work. Do you ever think about what a privilege that is? That we who believe in God are allowed to see his hand in different things? That's an incredible privilege. I mean, we take it for granted. You know, we come and somebody says, so-and-so, we prayed for this person. We prayed for that person. Yeah, thank you for your prayers. This was a result of... Yeah, we see God's hand in things. And those who have contempt, they deny it. They don't see it. It's very sad. All those people who were there because of their contempt for God did not see this great miracle. Then Mark says, taking the child by the hand, he said to her, Talitha cum, which translated means, little girl, I say to you, get up. Immediately, the girl got up and began to walk, for she was 12 years old. And immediately they were completely astounded, and he gave them strict orders that no one should know about this. And here's a little compassion again, in case I forget to mention it at the end. He said they should give her something to eat. I love that. That is so great. Hey, get up. Hey, listen. No, give her. He looks a little hungry, this kid. That's incredible. The Son of God, the character of God, the compassion of God. Messiah spoke to her in Aramaic, which is most likely the language he taught in, what most of the people spoke at the time. Jewish people living in the land at that time mostly spoke Aramaic. The leaders, the teachers, people knew Hebrew, but it was mostly Aramaic, the common language. He says, Talitha cum. And this to me too, it shows the great compassion of him. Little girl, get up. That's what he says to her. The term little girl alone, that's an affectionate term. I mean, I call my granddaughters that sometimes. They say, hey, little girl. You know, it's not girl, get up. It's not whatever, get up. It's little girl. And an interesting thing I only found 2 people that said this, which was enough because I think it's true. But anyway, Talitha is a feminine form for youth, little girl. It also is used for a little lamb. And to me, too, that just shows, can you imagine the compassion of Jesus? And in the midst of all of this, the pressing in, the legion, all of this stuff, he's, hey, little lamb, get up. That's what he says. He just commands her to get up, and she does. So much tenderness from the Son of God. So much tenderness shown to that woman who suffered beyond what we could ever know. And then he shows compassion to this little girl. Just tenderness, just real tenderness from God. A few words, and she's alive. And it says the little group was astounded. You know, we would say, well, maybe not all of us, but that freaked me out, man. Yeah. Man, what happened in there? That blew my mind, man. You should have seen that little girl. He just, little girl, poof, she's up. That's it. You know, that was the count. And now that he's back on the Jewish side, he gives them a command too. Do not let the word get out. He didn't want everybody to follow him for healings. He wanted them to follow him so they could come to know God. So he tells them not to do it. Now he's back on the Jewish side. Quick observation. Why does Mark sandwich these stories together? Oh, we have Jairus and the woman. 2 totally different people. One is a leader in society. The other is an outcast in society. One is well off. The other spent all she had. One has a name and is named. The other is not. But they had a few things in common. Both were desperate. Both needed faith. And both had no hope outside of the Messiah. They were called to have faith over their circumstances. And this, I think, is an important thing, especially in the world we live in today. Not just to have faith, but to have faith in the Messiah. There's so many people today that are spiritual, that have faith. And not to be offensive, but I always see, especially on Facebook, I hear people say, listen to me, I'm in the hospital. I have to have a serious heart operation. And I just wanted you to know, I want people to know. And you see people write, sending you positive thoughts. I don't really know what that means. And I don't mean to be offensive, but I much rather petition God, the creator of everything in the universe, the one in complete control, than have a good friend of mine send me positive thoughts. I appreciate the sentiment. I really, really do. But sending me positive thoughts, I'm not exactly sure what that means. And the other thing which has become real popular in the last several years is that I'm going to hold you in the light. I literally am so confused when I read that. I don't know. I'm going to hold you in the light. Okay? Is it like a flashlight, a searchlight, a candlelight? I don't, I understand again. I know, and I would never criticize people that say, I know what they mean in their heart, and I so appreciate it. But faith in a positive thought, or faith in a light, is nothing like faith in Jesus. And that's what he was telling these people. Jairus didn't want the positive thoughts of all the people in the crowd. He wanted a response from the God of the universe. This woman who was sick didn't want to be held in the light, but she wanted to know the light of the world. That's what made the difference. And that's what they did. A faith based in Messiah looks beyond circumstances with a certain hope. And just briefly, I want to say this to you because this is the unasked question. What happens when it doesn't work? What happens when we come to God in sincerity? We ask him to heal a friend, a family member, a child, and it doesn't happen. What do you do in a case like that? What does it do when our faith seems to be unanswered? And the only response that I could give you is the same response that Jesus gave to Jairus. Keep believing. Keep believing in me, regardless of how everything looks. He said to the woman, don't be afraid any longer, only believe. He is worthy of our faith, and we keep believing. And I don't say this as an excuse. I know there's people that criticize people that are born again and say, well, God didn't do this, God didn't do that. You make excuses for him. It's not really true. Think about the whole origin of the deal. We realize who we are. We come to God. We confess our sin. We come into a relationship with him, and we become his servants. That's really what we are. We're not the ones in charge. He is. When we place our faith in him when we understand things, we place our faith in him when we don't understand things, we place our faith in him when things go our way, we place our faith in him when things don't go our way, we're servants. We're servants of the Most High God, and we keep believing because we know who he is. We submit to God's will because we are the servants of God. And just like he told Jairus, that's no matter what happens in the world, no matter what circumstances seem to say, I will take Jesus at his word and keep believing.